the rumors to come out of these GM meetings. Something that kind of caught us off guard when we were looking at it this week. Eugenio Suarez's name was thrown around, reported by Ben Nicholson-Smith of Sportsnet. That's Canada, by the way. They cover the Blue Jays. And Ben Nicholson-Smith was saying that the Blue Jays, I don't know if how official they've checked in on, but Eugenio Suarez's name was floated around as a person of interest for the Toronto Blue Jays. What do you think about that?
I'm not shocked. Were you shocked to see that he was floated around in trade rumors? This is a guy who has a year left on his contract, and I'm sure some teams are interested. He's on the opposite end of 30. I wasn't shocked to see that his name was thrown out there.
I think it's an interesting, a curious fit. There is a hole at third base for the Blue Jays. Matt Chapman's a free agent. I don't know if they're going to re-sign him. I was also thinking about this in the Mariners sense for seeing his name thrown around. I mean, we talked about Vladdy last week on our mailbag episode as a potential trade candidate, but you couldn't acquire Vladimir Guerrero Jr. for Eugenio Suarez. So, like, that idea gets thrown out the window. So I'm thinking on the other side of this, it's like, okay, if this were actually to make sense on the Mariners side, who on the Blue Jays would you want? And I came down to 4 names on the Blue Jays major league roster that I would want for Eugenio Suarez. George Springer, potentially. Dalton Varsho is another one that Jerry could like. And then the 2 catchers, or one of the 2 catchers, they have 2 that they like, Danny Jansen and Alejandro Kirk. Those are the 4 guys when I'm looking at it. I'm like, okay, those 4 make sense in some form or fashion. Now, I didn't include any minor leaguers on this list because I'm just going to make this clear. If Eugenio Suarez gets traded off the roster for minor league players, that's flat out bad baseball, and that's bad management for what the Mariners are going to achieve next season. Just flat out bad if that were the case. So that's not even something I will consider in this.
Oh, Mariners fans are going to start boycotting if they do that.
And it's not like the Blue Jays have like a banger of a farm system. They have 2 top 100 prospects. And yeah, it's like there's just not a whole lot of upside in that system that you can tap into. So those were bats, at least. I was more focused on bats. The Mariners could trade for pitching. I think if the Mariners are going to acquire pitching this offseason, it's going to be signing pitching as opposed to trading for pitching. But if we're looking at 4 bats that would make sense in some form or fashion on the Mariners, I think Springer, Varsho, and then either of the 2 catchers. Because as we know, the Mariners have an open backup catcher spot, and both those 2 guys flip around quite a lot, and they offer each have a little bit of upside in some capacity.
What if the Mariners need some pressure in their tires? You want to trade for Alek Manoah?
I forgot about him. His value is not very high right now.
No, not at all.
I feel like Eugenio might be an overpay for trading for Alek Manoah.
Well, considering he was in like
rookie
complex league ball this year. Yeah. Like, I mean, and didn't even crack the playoff roster. He was just relegated to AAA by the end of the year. Yeah, his value is about as low as it could be. It's funny. Okay, so now in all seriousness, you thought of 4 guys. I just kept circling back to 1, maybe 2. The one guy that stood out to me is George Springer. Varsho a little bit, because despite a bad offensive season, you're still talking about a dude that was nearly a 4-WAR player just from his defense and can play the corner outfield spots. So if the Mariners need corner outfielders, Varsho's got a chance to add some value. I don't really think the Blue Jays would move on from him, though, which is why I tossed his name aside more so, because I don't think for a guy that isn't on some big contract, is just going to start making ARB money, that the Blue Jays would just get rid of him after a year. Mm-hmm. But there's not a ton on this roster that makes a ton of sense for the Mariners. There's like the Blue Jays roster in terms of the Mariners' needs. There's just not a whole lot that adds up. The one guy where I said, okay, maybe, is George Springer. Right-handed bat, corner outfielder, doesn't strike out a lot, walks a decent amount. Coming off what was not a good year for him, because he is usually putting up numbers that like emulate that of a perennial all-star, where he did not do that in 2023. But if the Mariners like the idea of buying low, you think he could bounce back, and you get 3 years of him and take on that contract in exchange for Gino, because that's what Springer has left on his deal, might make sense.
It'd be absorbing quite a bit of money. So about $24 million a year for the next 3 seasons for his age 35, 36, and 37 seasons. So if you think that's worth it, yes, this makes sense. There wasn't too much underlying that was, I guess, overly concerning with George Springer. It was just some regression across the board. He's been a very consistently good hitter for pretty much every season of his career up until this past season. I'm not totally sold on the idea of buying a guy at age 35 to turn around again. And I keep going back into this, but into a really shitty hitting ballpark. I mean, it could not be a worse hitting ballpark for George Springer that he would get traded to. He's not a guy with a track record of incredible health. And you move him to the corner outfield. He's almost a career center fielder, but they moved him into right field this season to ease him off his feet a little bit more. Obviously, it didn't help out with his bat all that much, and I'm just a little skeptical. I don't know if I would buy a rebound of George Springer, which is why I would say I don't know if this makes a whole lot of sense, because if you're going to get a 100 like WRC plus out of a hitter, which George Springer could give you next season because he just had a 101, 102 this year. Fangraphs, by the way, when I was looking up yesterday, just was not working, not cooperating.
No, it was not.
I have his OPS plus, which is 102, and it's WRC plus, OPS plus, usually pretty close. So we'll throw that in the same category. But I was saying, Lau, if you want like a 102 WRC plus, like can't Dom Canzone do that for you already next year? Like you already have that on your roster, and you wouldn't have to give him anything up for him. And besides everything else I just mentioned with George Springer, so like that's why when you think about Dalton Varsho, it's like, okay, well, there's more defensive upside here, more WAR. But you are correct in saying, why would the Blue Jays give up on him? They just gave up a haul for him last year. Gabriel Moreno is a stud catcher for the Diamondbacks now, and they gave him up to go get Varsho last offseason. So it wouldn't make any sense. So that's why I'm sitting here thinking about that. This is a very interesting and maybe not convenient fit for Eugenio Suarez.
So Springer would be a little bit younger than you're giving him credit for. It'd be 34, 35, 36 rather than 35, 36, 37 because he's about to enter his age 34 season. And to his credit, for a guy that has had injury problems a lot of his career, last 2 seasons for the most part he has been on the field. 154 games this past year, 133 the year before that. So he has been relatively healthy, and I'm just buying the idea that I don't think a 102 WRC plus is who George Springer is. The ballpark factor is something to consider, but when you look at what he has done most of his career, ballparks have not held him down. You're talking about a guy that just mashes on a year-by-year basis, like truly mashes. And if you need to, Mariners kind of have a DH spot open right now. If you don't want George Springer out in the outfield for 120 games, he could spend a lot of time at DH. I don't hate the fit. I really don't. And I also don't think the Mariners would eat all $24 million a year of that contract. I am sure that the Blue Jays would be taking on some of it, which would be hugely beneficial in this, if not necessary. What is the holdup for me with this is, while I think of anybody on this team for Toronto, George Springer would be the best fit if the Mariners were going to flip Geno somewhere. But I think more of the holdup for me is, why would the Mariners do this? Because then all of a sudden you're shit out of luck with a third baseman, and there's nobody to fill Suarez's role next year.
You got me. That's why I say this is odd. That's why this doesn't make any sense. Really. This could be the Blue Jays just looking for potential third base help, calling and checking in everywhere they can. They sound like they want to bring Matt Chapman back. Will that happen? TBD. Matt Chapman's probably going to demand a lot of money in a market that is not very friendly to hitters and is not very deep for hitters. So he might get a big paycheck from somebody that the Blue Jays may not want to shell out. So if that's the case, Toronto may be looking for other options. Just because they checked in with the Mariners doesn't mean the Mariners are interested, and this just got reported out there. So again, I don't hate the idea of George Springer. I think it's more the idea of, well, who are the Mariners filling the spot with next year? Because right now there is absolutely nobody if that ball rolls down to third base and Geno is not there. You could always do Josh Rojas in one spot and Ryan Bliss in the other. You could. I would say I don't think that's an acceptable starting lineup next year. Yes,
No.
I don't think so.
I don't
I don't
think
think
that's a
it
good idea.
is. No, I don't think it's a good idea either. So, yeah, you're right. I think this does circle back to why would the Mariners do this? And that's why I think I threw in the catchers as well. The catchers make some sense. It's a less crowded position. The Mariners need a backup. Jansen and Kirk have both had good seasons with the Blue Jays at the plate and behind the plate as well. So having that role, that backup catcher role filled could also be another option, but that's also somebody who's playing 60 games a year, 80 games a year, maybe. George Springer would play significantly more than that, and that's why I think Springer would be a more notable acquisition. I like your idea with the DH role. I think that would, I think if there would be anything for George Springer, I think it would be that. Because I think it would keep him a little bit healthier. I do get a little tingling of AJ Pollock PTSD if you're going after an outfielder with somewhat of an injury history that you're bringing in on a prove it, turn it around more aspect. George Springer is a little bit better of a player than AJ Pollock is, but age catches up with you quickly. I mean, just ask AJ, right?
I think Springer is at least a couple steps above what AJ Pollock ever was, outside of that one big year he had with the Diamondbacks. I mean, look at this. So before 2023, George Springer had a WRC plus of 130 or above in 5 of 6 seasons. He is a guy that puts up the numbers of a perennial all-star when he is on the field. So I would not quite put him in the AJ Pollock category. I understand what you're saying, that you don't want to see somebody come in here who has somewhat of a track record and just totally fall off. I don't quite think Springer would do that if he was here. And I think he is much better than Pollock is as a hitter. But I do understand what you're saying. If you don't want to be buying guys on the wrong end of 30 who are maybe starting to just trend down for the long haul rather than just one down year.
And in the end, let me ask my final question about this. Does this move the needle?
No, I don't think it does.
Right.
I don't.
Okay.
I think George Springer could cut down on some of the team's strikeouts. I think if he bounced back, it would be a great bat to have in the lineup. But again, then there is nobody at third base. Because here's the truth. Gino, when he was on fire throughout most of 2022, put up a WRC plus pretty close to 130. So if he can bounce back because he had such a tough year at the plate this year, then maybe he just is George Springer at the plate. If he bounces back and gets back to the 125, 130 range with his WRC plus, maybe that is essentially George Springer, who also plays great third base defense. And I think in this scenario for the Mariners, that's the best course of action rather than having to fill a void at third base.
And just trading players for the sake of trading players, which I feel like this trade would be if they trade Eugenio Suarez away. I think that feels like what that would be, especially if that's the kind of return you're getting. Doesn't seem like it really contributes that much to increasing the success of the 2024 season. And that's what these moves this offseason are supposed to do. It's not supposed to be shuffling. It's supposed to be improvements across the board. That's what we need to see. We need to see them get better. And this scenario does not make them better.
I think it makes most sense for Gino to stay at third. That's probably what will happen. Hopefully he bounces back. And then they get Munetaka Murakami next year.
I'm down. Sign me up.
Ultimately, Gino unlikely to get moved. We'll certainly keep an eye on this as the offseason rolls along.